Welcome to Straight Outta Health IT. Getting into health tech is rough, but here's an unfiltered dialogue of healthcare leaders and influencers covering a wide variety of issues affecting healthcare and the health tech industry. And now your host, Christopher Cunny.
Hello, everyone. This is Christopher Cunny again, and welcome back to another episode of Straight Outta Health IT. I'm again so excited to have on the program today an amazing woman who has a very interesting story and journey that I think all of you are going to appreciate as we have this conversation with her today. Dr. Mary Branch, MD and MS. She is the department head of cardio-oncology at Cone Health. Let me just take a few minutes to give you an overview of her background, and then we'll get her on the show and have her share her story and what she's passionate about today. Dr. Mary Branch is a fourth generation African-American born physician from Cleveland, Ohio, but she was raised in Youngstown. She actually left home at 14 to attend a very prestigious New England prep school where she gained a lot of her insights and passions, I think, for healthcare as well, and she'll share a little more detail about that. She set out on a mission to identify really what her unique gifts were to serve her community, and she continues down that path. And I always say life's a journey and not a destination, so we're always evolving and trying to find those things we're passionate about, and it sounds like Dr. Branch is doing the same. She was formerly educated at Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University. She completed she received her master's actually from Wake Forest University as well. She continued her studies, and I'll let her give you a little more detail on that, at two major healthcare teaching facilities, both the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She had studied and had a fellowship in cardiovascular disease at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center as well. Interesting enough, she was born to two African-American parents and her mother was an infectious disease physician and her father was a lawyer. She goes on to say that although it sounds like she was a carbon copy of the Cosbys, it wasn't quite that way. Unfortunately, like many families today, her parents divorced. Although that happened, her mom actually remarried, and she was actually raised by her stepdad, which again, she can share more details on that, who was actually a famous artist, professor, and well-known at Town Hero. Interesting enough, her journey in medicine was met with many bumps in the road, and I'm sure she'll share a lot more detail on that. After years of research in medical school, she didn't get a residency position, and she actually had to fight her way back into medicine. She continued to believe that she belonged in medicine and had a purpose there, and continued to focus on making that a reality. After 2 years of working in Harvard lab with $400,000 in debt, she made her way back. And again, I want to hear that story in a lot more detail. She started her medical training with the opioid pandemic in Pittsburgh, and she persisted and transferred to North Carolina for the person that she loved and continued to work there. She finished her residency at the University of Chapel Hill, and then she went on to cardiology or fellowship as the first African-American female in that program. Congratulations. Of course, throughout that journey, she's experienced bias, inhumanity, and challenges of motherhood. Her father unfortunately succumbed to rapid dementia, and her stepdad passed away 1 year later. And then COVID hit. Oh my God, just talk about, back-to-back challenges and difficulties. And we want to hear more about that. She actually chose throughout all of that to take accountability and grow herself before healing. While doing that, she actually, unfortunately, herself had a nervous breakdown and found herself going back on the journey of recovery through therapy. And so, again, we want to delve into some of that as well, too. And yet, throughout all of that, she was able to earn her Master's of Science degree and is now considered an internationally recognized budding cardio-oncologist and is now leading that effort at Cone Health. Welcome again to the program, Dr. Branch. What an amazing story. like I've said in many of my programs, that's your resume. Now we want to hear your journey. So I would love for you to, first of all, take a few minutes just to fill in some of the blanks in that resume and talk a little bit about, your passion for healthcare, what got you into it, and some of the things that we highlighted in your resume. Provide a little more context around that, the challenges you experienced, the counseling you received, and then just where you are in terms of your focus around your passion in the industry today.
Sure. That's was an amazing overview. I don't think I've ever had such a picture painted in that way. I think you did an excellent job really sort of describing my journey. So, how I started off, I was born, as I mentioned, two parents, kind of like the Cosby Show. We actually at one point lived in Minnesota in the 80s during the Prince era. It was a time of just, we were financially very stable. It was sort of a happy home, sort of initially, and I grew up around just sort of Black excellence. It wasn't sort of a question, it was more of an expectation. Of course, not only were you going to pursue your education, but more than likely you were going to pursue a graduate education. So a
Absolutely.
lot of these things were just, it wasn't like, well, if you make it or this, it was just, this is part of the group. This is part of our culture. This is who
Sure.
we are.
I can
And
imagine
so
four generations of physicians. I mean, that's just part for the course. You're expected to continue.
indeed, which can be good and bad, right?
Right,
Because
right.
now your expectations can be very hard. And, when they came around, they had their challenges, but certainly
Absolutely.
that doesn't take away from each generation having their own unique challenges kind of based on the era that you've come into. But there's a lot of sort of similarities. So, again, my grandmother is very well known in the South. She was a mathematician. She taught calculus. She was a professor. She was also a politician, one of the first African American politicians in the local city council here in Winston-Salem. So again, these are just sort of a lot of highlights, a lot of people who are really making changes. So I knew that this was the path for me. I want to move the needle. I want to bring change, but how am I going to do that specifically? So I
Exactly.
grew up, my parents separated, they divorced, the situation didn't work. It worked out well on paper, but not necessarily in the home. Right.
Sure.
And so in the early 1990s, my mom, we went to Youngstown, Ohio, kind of abruptly, just sort of left the whole scene into a completely different scene without any kind of explanation or understanding. It's just, this is the new reality for you, essentially.
Exactly.
And so I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, sort of near LeBron country, very blue collar, very hardworking Americans. And we had a nice sort of community where, you knew the police, you knew people at the store, you knew everyone at the grocery store. I mean, it was just sort of a nice community to grow up in where you can look out for one another.
Sure.
And it's one of those utopias where, in terms of race, I know in a lot of other communities, there can be like a misconception and someone calls the police and things can really escalate. But the nice thing about Youngstown, Ohio is that we, at least in the sort of the township that I lived in, those scenarios didn't necessarily play out because we were looking out for each other and making sure that families were being called and that people were being involved and making sure that everybody's kids were doing okay.
Exactly.
So
Kind of a different
I would,
value system back then as well, too. I
yeah,
grew up in the deep South, and
yeah,
I can think of maybe on two occasions where there was some sense of bias as I was growing up. But I grew up
right,
in a community very similar to that as well, where everyone kind of looked after each other, whether you were black or white or whatever. It was just
right,
culture.
right. And that's very possible. I mean, my grandmother grew up in the 1920s. She's 104. And
Wow.
even when she grew up in Davie County, North
Mhm.
Carolina, she grew up it was essentially the plantation land of, her great great grandfather was a slave owner
Right.
and he had children with his slaves. And so the family continued to develop, and there were sort of the white Kimbros and the black Kimbros,
Exactly.
but they still did look out for each other. And so if they did something wrong, someone would say, "Oh, are you Buck Kimbrough's kid? Like, you know better than that." It
Right.
wasn't, "I'm taking you to jail and now your career's ruined," and things like that. So these utopias are possible. I do hope that that's something. I think health related is extremely important to understand that we all are part of a community and we're all sort of responsible for looking out for each other.
Yeah.
So in Youngstown, things were getting kind of tough, though, kind of in the inner city portions of it. There were a lot of drugs. A lot of people were getting kind of pregnant early, just because of that was sort of the expectation sometimes, because there
Sure.
wasn't as much emphasis on higher education. I was very privileged in that sense. And so my mom thought, well, I think maybe it'd be better to kind of get out of this environment and pursue my academics, because that's something that I was very, very focused on. Because that was a constant, right? That was a
Right.
constant in my life.
Exactly.
Family life was up in the air. I was different. I actually integrated a Jewish school,
Oh, interesting.
um, because that was the only private school in the area. So I was the first, Black to integrate the school. We learned Hebrew in the beginning of the first half, and then the second half with math and science and things like that. So I kind of grew up in the Jewish faith in a
Sure.
way, and that
Sure.
was part of my community as well.
Exactly.
And they took me in. I was different. I obviously noticed difference. So, the first time obviously was when we learned about slavery.
Right.
And for them, they said, okay, they took people, they went across the ocean, and then they were enslaved. And I thought, wow, that is so sad that this
Never
happened to
really
people.
internalizing it, right? That was my journey, my people, and not really understanding the brutality of all of that and the psychological impact it's had on our community as well. It was always kind of sanitized in our
Yeah.
education system.
Yeah. And we're not always prepped for it,
That's
because
right.
I was 9, and that was a shock. Like, what? Because where I grew up, my grandmother was talking about mathematicians and
Right.
scientists. Like, what is this?
Exactly.
And so it was a shock, and I kind of knew that I was only 9. So race is a social construct within the United States. So, and it's sort of a hierarchy and understanding part of the sort of the game in a way. So I wasn't very clear on that at
Hmm.
that time.
Right.
My hair was different. I'm very fair skinned. So the only thing that differentiated me from the other kids is that my hair was very different.
Exactly.
But now there's this huge wedge in our history. They did have the Holocaust, but this was something different. So I was very distraught, and I looked around and everybody was staring at me, and I thought, well, why aren't they upset that this happened to people? I don't get it.
Right.
And then I kind of dawned on me, this happened to Black people. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
it's different now.
It very is very much so, and so fast forward, you graduate from this prestigious school, and now you're trying to figure out your life career. You want to practice medicine,
Yeah.
or you make that decision at some point. Talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that journey as well, too, because it sounds like you've had some challenges and some triumphs as a part of that journey.
Absolutely. Yeah. So fast forward, ended up going to prep school in New England, got a great education there, went to Smith College, which is a school sort of for women leadership. And while I was there, was kind of dabbling around what do I want to do? And I ended up going to a program, through privileged knowledge at Yale, where they focused on people of color who wanted to go into medical school.
Right.
So it was called SMEP back then. I think it's SMDEP now. But we were it was just us, just students of color interested in medicine at Yale. They're like, here's the strategy to go to medical school. This is what you need to do. So I knew that I wanted to go into medicine because of the people. The people were dynamic. They were diverse. They had a diverse sense of interests. And these are the people that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, because I didn't see a job as a job. This is a lifestyle. This is a career.
Exactly.
This is my life. So decided that medicine was the role for me, but I was going to create my own spin and not just kind of be a carbon copy kind of former generations. And then from there, I took the MCAT a couple times. I tend to overthink a lot, and so I'm not the best test taker.
Right. But that says a
I'm
lot,
not.
right? Yeah, that says a lot. You can be a very smart person, know your
Yeah,
subject, but standardized tests don't always work for everyone.
they don't.
Yeah.
And if you have a conversation with me and we talk about it, I can tell you the concepts, and we can go through it. And that's just how I talk and learn. And I do well clinically with patients.
Sure.
But I overthink on tests. Well, it could be this, but it could be that. But it's just also my Libra sense too. So anyway, so I took
Right.
it, I took it a couple times, and I said, they said, here are the numbers that you really need. And it is a numbers game. So I said, okay, well, out of the 3, it hit the number that they needed. I have a broad palette of other things that I do. I volunteer. I started a pre-med organization for women of color. And so, this is it. So I ended up going to medical school at Case Western. Things went pretty well, but some of the struggles, I would say, at medical school were really centered around feedback. And I think the Harvard business publications talked about this specifically with women
Uh-huh.
in higher spaces. So essentially,
Expound on that a little bit more.
yeah. So the biggest issue I would have was during feedback sessions. So what would happen was sometimes with men would give me sometimes constructive feedback, like, here, this is something tangible and actionable that you can do during your presentation.
Right.
Make sure that you are more clear when you are stating the problem, and just state one problem and give your differential and then give your bullet points, right? So that's something actionable.
Sure.
That's something I can do. That's something that I can develop to be better.
Right.
With women, either there was just an awkward energy and they didn't like it. I could just kind of tell from their energy that they weren't comfortable me being there. And it was any race of woman, honestly. And when we would get in the room for feedback, the feedback would lead me into a spiral of mental gymnastics, and it was very distracting, and I would become very distraught because, again, medicine was my constant, right? And authority and doing well was also just my way of receiving love, honestly.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because that's how I received love growing up. You do well, we'll give you affection.
Exactly. So talk to us a little bit more about, and then I do want to, because I'm going to absolutely have to have you back, because we're not going to cover everything I want to talk about today. But so talk to me about also, obviously, going to school as a female in medical school, and challenges, some challenges you mentioned, but also as, you know, the LGBTQ community. And, you know, the impact that any of that journey in life had on you, and just in general.
Yeah, definitely. And just briefly going back to the last point, just the last portion of it, is that it just, a lot of the feedback was very abstract. And I would really want to encourage, it was kind of like a Devil Wears Prada moment. It was like, it's nothing you could do was sort of enough. And the feedback was, well, you're too confident, or, you know, things that weren't actionable. So those are things I struggled with. And those are the things that led to sort of a lot of mental gymnastics, and it was distracting and distressful, and it may have led to not matching ultimately. But also my strategy wasn't very good, but I was just sort of lost at that point. But anyway, so going back to your point about kind of moving forward and how the LGBTQ community has impacted my role. So I went to Smith College in 2003 to 2007. So Smith, I would say, is at least 30% probably identify themselves as lesbian, but we had the gamut certainly of that entire community. And a lot of people were very free to really express themselves from a gender perspective. So certainly there were a lot of folks that were transgender, and that was a lot of their plight, and that they fought a lot for that particular equity. So that was a way for me to see people fighting for their rights, kind of like, you know, in the 60s, where you would go to school and you were being sort of a African-American organization. This was sort of a similar thing where I can see it kind of in real time, how people were fighting for their rights. So I learned a lot.
It was a bubble too, right? It was a little bit of a bubble, because
What's that?
It was a little bit of a bubble, I think, as well, too, because you were in an environment where it was really accepting. You know, you had a large majority of a large percentage of folks who identified, you know, with those sexual orientations, and it wasn't necessarily, you know, not accepted. It was actually embraced, I would imagine, based on what you're describing.
Further, I mean, that was the culture. So where you felt awkward being heterosexual, or not heterosexual. Yeah, you felt you know, you felt awkward being kind of cis and being heterosexual. But so I was grateful that I had exposure to different ideas of gender, because when I grew up, I never really thought of myself like female meant you have limitations. I have 4 brothers. And so that label meant you can't drive the John Deere. We're very country. You're not driving the John Deere. You can't do this and that. So, but I never subscribed to that. I said, I like to play football. That doesn't make me a tomboy. So Smith was great because I was able to embrace that. I was embrace leadership without the label of gender. Now, the tough part also was I was starting a pre-med organization for African Americans, and it seemed like it was almost a zero sum in terms of what you can sort of promote and what you can't, and what they're going to really back up and what they're not. And so it almost becomes kind of a 360 sort of an Animal Farm scenario, where it's like, well, you guys sometimes could be just as oppressive as everybody else when I'm trying to get more women of color into medicine.
Exactly. Wow. So
Um,
you were dealing with, challenges on multiple fronts, whether it was
yeah,
generally as a gender, as from your, sexual orientation to now your racial identity, all
right.
having to be acknowledged, advocated for, and navigating the biases as you also try to go and get secure a degree in a very difficult subject matter as well too.
Absolutely. And I just, and I was so privileged though, because I knew my foundation, I knew my
Right.
roots.
Sure.
Like nobody could convince me that I couldn't because it's in
Right.
my DNA.
Exactly. Yeah, you had
So,
you had role
yeah,
models and examples, generations of them that
right,
overcame those challenges that served as a foundation for you.
right. So I was privileged in that sense. I could call my mom. She, was infectious disease. She grew up in the 70s. That was clearly
Hmm.
a very different era. HIV had just come into play, and she saw a lot of sort of discriminatory practices with, patients and just physicians just dismissing Black women and things. So she
Right.
dealt with a lot, certainly. So I, was privileged to have somebody to say, it's, this is this is how things are. It's okay. You can continue to proceed. Obviously we're very similar, and so you can
Exactly.
continue to proceed in medicine. Yeah.
Right.
So I was lucky in that sense.
So fast forward, now
Yeah.
you've gone through your formal education. Now
Right.
you're, pursuing your residency, and you talked about some of the challenges of motherhood. Talk
Yeah.
a little bit about that, and then, obviously you felt things became overwhelming for
Yeah.
you, and you needed to
Yeah.
seek some support. And so I
Yeah.
originally I thought we were going to talk about a completely different subject, but this is so much more important now that I want to cover this, and then I
Yeah.
want to bring you back, and we're going to talk about other
The
stuff.
other thing.
But
That sounds great.
this is something I want to to get more insight on.
Yeah, and I appreciate that so much, just to have a
Absolutely.
voice, because I think there are other women that could this will resonate with, and I appreciate you for this.
Sure.
So in terms of motherhood, so I started my internal medicine so I was at UPMC in Pittsburgh, got back on the horse, did research, and then finally was able to get back into medicine, decided that internal medicine was the route for me instead of pediatrics. So working that out, things are going great. I'm feeling good. I met someone during that time period, friend of the family, and we were getting close. And I said, well, if I'm kind of in my 30s now, it's probably a good idea for us to be in the same place. So I
Mhm.
actually ended up transferring residencies. I had a very supportive program director who was a woman as well, and who understood some of the challenges that we may face as women in medicine. And a lot of times age can be there. I think there's high rates of just infertility in women
Sure.
because we're waiting so long. And so they were very, I think, mindful of that. And they said, sure, go ahead, come on down, to UNC. So that is very challenging, but it was a great experience to have two different experiences within my training. And then we decided to get married. And so I had this sort of fantasy. I'm in the fantasy, I'm getting married, I'm in medicine, everything's perfect. And so kind of when I was wrapped up in the fantasy, I said, okay, well, why don't I get
Right.
pregnant?
Exactly. Why
but
not?
the,
Right.
why not?
Yeah.
Right? We're all in fantasy land now. But honestly, I grew up just focusing on medicine and focusing on academics. I didn't know
Right.
anything about relationships,
Sure.
about raising a child, about the impact and the implications of that.
Exactly.
I really was
The
the
sacrifices.
sacrifice.
Mhm.
Yes,
Yes,
the time that you have to take. Okay, when you have a child, there is some you have to step back.
that's right.
It's very hard to not step back from what you're doing. But for me, I'm a freight train. I'm going.
Exactly.
And so
Type A
now I'm like,
personality, right?
yes. So now I'm like, well, I got pregnant and still think because things tend to just work out for me, right?
Sure,
I didn't
sure,
match, but I still
sure.
made it. It's gonna
Exactly.
work out. We're
Right.
fine. So, but baby came and she's a force. Her birthday is tomorrow. She's a
Oh,
Leo.
happy birthday.
to to her. She's 4, and it was just one of the greatest challenges. One, I wasn't offered maternity leave. So not only was it something I was struggling with on my own, I now moved to a different state with someone else's family away from my own family. So I didn't really have people around me to talk to about what this was going to be like and how to set up more help. And so I'm
Sure.
scrambling to get help. And then, but with my job, I'm so focused and dedicated to that. But while I was there was no one said, here's maternity leave. This is the time you can take to do X, Y, and Z, or here's the time allotted for you to have. I was
Sure.
getting my master's during fellowship.
Oh,
So I
wow.
was getting my master's and nursing at the same time and postpartum,
All right. So you
during this
just
period.
a glutton for punishment.
I am.
Wow.
Hence therapy.
Exactly.
But
So
again,
what triggered
yeah,
what triggered
yeah,
the fact that you
the
felt like you needed to seek some
seek it.
professional advice? Or,
Sure.
work?
So I was giving my all 110% on every front. As a mother, I had to try to be the best, stay up all night, do everything I can on my own a lot of times. But then, I incorporated my former spouse, kind of picked up and helped further on. But then also, trying to be the best as a wife. And then I go to fellowship, trying to be the best cardiology fellow, trying to give them everything I had. Because again, that's how I get affection. That's how I seek love, is that I'm doing well, right?
Exactly.
And then everything's okay. And then, my grandmother lives here, so I'm trying to give her everything. So I was trying to give everybody everything. I'm trying and trying and trying. And then I just, one day I just kind of was in a tailspin. And I was just like, you have to stop trying. This
Sure.
is not okay. And so I just sort of just was extremely distraught. My spouse at the time was very concerned. And he just said, I'm going to take you to the emergency room. And so there was an ambulance that came to the house. My child was crying. And I have, mental health issues within my family.
Right.
My father, I think, had depression. His
Sure.
mother died young, and she was in a mental institution, but I don't know why or
Right.
what happened. But I just know that she died very young, at 45.
Exactly.
So I knew this was something that would plague me throughout my life. And I made a decision that if it ever impacted my child, then that's when I would seek help.
Sure. That's great that you were self-aware,
Yeah.
and recognized it, and
Yeah.
sought that help. And I tell you, girl,
Yeah.
I say, girl, I apologize.
No worries.
I tell you,
I get it. I got
only
you.
because your story is so similar to even my own. I come from
Wow.
3 generations of educators. My
Yeah.
grandmother was a principal.
Yeah.
We had this, this foundation of excellence in our family. We grew up in
Yeah.
my parents grew up on a farm, and so
Yeah.
I had that experience, as well too. And then just the challenges of meeting those expectations that were laid,
Right.
foundational expectations that were laid upon you at a young
Right.
age, and then trying to not only achieve those but overachieve, right? I need to
Yeah.
be better and do more than the last generation.
Correct.
And those pressures that have been placed upon you to do that. And then I had a mental illness in my family as well too. We never really talked about it. What was wrong
Right.
with not, Susie, and it was always
Right.
kind of quiet. And so, to be self-aware, recognize that when you're in that place where you feel like you're losing control or you can't balance life effectively, it's so important to say that's okay, and you need to go seek help so you can know how to manage life better.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to follow up on that promise that I made to myself. And I didn't want to give into a void.
Sure.
Because my father, who had depression, was an alcoholic.
Exactly.
And what led to his rapid demencia and his death was alcohol.
Absolutely.
So
hey,
I
Dr.
just,
Branch, we have literally 4 minutes. And I got to have you back on the podcast. So, because we haven't even touched on, any of
the pursuits and things.
Exactly. Which we want. What this is, again, I think hopefully will bless other people. Just hearing your story and the fact that, someone who's achieved so much, this didn't come easy. It came in a process. And it's important for people to hear that story so that they know how to, that they're not different, unusual, that, life presents these difficulties. There's ways to try to navigate them and mitigate them. So,
right. And set expectations and know that, knowing that can be messy sometimes, but that's the expectation, but you can continue to pursue your mission.
Right. So 1 minute. Can you quickly share with us your role, what you're doing, your passion?
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
then we'll bring you back on and we'll do more detail on that.
Yeah, so thank God I found something that I really love. So I shadowed cardiologists. I loved cardiology because it matched who I was, a very versatile role. And I fell into the idea of taking care of people with cancer because I thought
Hmm.
that was very meaningful. And I felt like I'm really practicing medicine when I am having family meetings and talking to people about their health and that from that perspective. So I got into cardio oncology, was very fortunate that it was a very pivotal period for cardio oncology. It was in its infancy when I first learned about it. And so now I've been able to be one of the sort of known folks within cardio oncology just because of the timing and also my dedication to it since residency until now. So I joined a private practice and I said, well, this is my interest. You all don't have a department. I'm happy to start small and build it. And they said, great. And so now I am beginning to lean into that role. I think a lot of my past experiences will help me be a great leader.
Absolutely.
And I look forward to taking care of folks with cancer and preventing heart disease and having, in this next chapter, having a little bit more peace and joy on this journey.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Branch, for sharing your story, your journey in life. And as I said earlier, life's a journey and not a
Yeah,
destination. So I
indeed.
appreciate you giving us an update on where you are at this point. I am going to
Yes.
have you back for us to do a deeper dive in your passions and pursuits around
Sure.
heart disease, because that's an important topic we need to cover as well.
Yes.
But I do thank you for sharing your life story with our listeners, and I hope they found and got some benefit from, and I know they found and got some, because I know I did, from the story and your journey in life as well. I want to thank.
Absolutely. And if they want to learn more, they can go to bipocmedicine.com, which is my website. It shows a lot of my writings and story there. If that's hopefully that will inspire many.
Sounds great, and we'll make sure we
Yeah.
promote that on in our marketing of the broadcast as well too.
Awesome.
Wow, another episode of Straight Out of Health IT has come to an end. Thank you so much, Dr. Branch, for taking time out of your very busy schedule to share your life's journey with us and your challenges, your triumphs, your overall perspective of what's happening, in our industry. It was extremely insightful, and I think I took quite a bit of nuggets of wisdom from you in this episode. So I want to give you a chance to kind of finalize or provide some words of wisdom or thoughts that you might think would be of value to folks who are entering to the healthcare field, or just in journey in life as you go through challenges and issues as we try to figure out what we want to be when we grow up. So I'll turn it over to you and let you share your final thoughts.
Absolutely. And thank you again for this platform. I'm exceptionally grateful. So, my final thoughts, some of the final points that I've learned along the way is that, your journey is your own, no matter what you're pursuing. And, it's important to have a mission, but understand that you're going to be led in your purpose,
Exactly.
that you don't always have control. And I do think it's important to kind of stay in your lane and kind of get a good sense of what your lane is. And there are some things that are going to happen in your life that you just can't fight, but it's important to kind of continue to believe in yourself, to continue to love yourself and take breaks when you need them, but don't stop and get help and recognize when it is time to get help. And sort of another point is kind of at the end of the rainbow, what you realize is true is that the goal that you're seeking is actually inside you.
Absolutely.
So that final destination that you think is you're going to get that final pot of gold, it's been in you the whole time. And so if you can just embrace the journey, it's par for the course, continue to love yourself and those that show love to you, and keep your circle, be intentional about those around you and about your goals. And I think that's it. We don't always have an answer, but I think at least there's some type of guide that we can follow.
Well, what a great piece of advice. It is definitely all about the journey and not necessarily the destination. And I think if you enjoy the process, you grow from it. You become wiser, hopefully wiser and more experienced
Yes.
behind those things you've been able to overcome. So again, Dr. Branch, I really appreciate your time. I want you back on as well too. There's so many other topics I want to cover with you. So expect another invitation in next season's episodes of Straight Out of Health IT. And again, to everyone who's listening, thank you again for your continued support. This wraps up this show. As you know, you can find us on all the different podcast medias. Please share with your colleagues and your associates. Let's make this particular episode go viral. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and God bless.
Thank you so much for listening to Straight Outta Health IT. We hope you enjoyed today's guest. For more unfiltered dialogue of healthcare leaders and influencers, be sure to tune in next week. For the show notes, transcripts, and resources, please visit Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite streaming platform. We invite you to give us feedback by reaching out to Christopher Cunny on LinkedIn, just searching for Straight Outta Health IT, and you'll find us. We are constantly having live discussions about diverse topics in the industry.